And I worry that trying to look at these in terms of moneyness is trying to compare Bitcoin with an apple. They're kind of not the same thing.
The one thing I point out is I don't really view my position as opposite of Rao. I actually think there's a ton of overlap. It's just not a perfect overlap. And the way I kind of look at it is, so for example, in the article, the overall conclusion is that I could see a non-zero allocation to Ethereum as making sense. And so I gave, for example, 80% Bitcoin, 20% Ethereum, or 90% Bitcoin, 10% Ethereum, or 100 to 0. I think there's still a case to kind of focus on Bitcoin, which is what I'm preferring to do. But I also point out that if Ethereum were to break over 1400, which now as of this recording it has, that's pretty bullish for the price action during a bull market in a broad sense. And so it's not necessarily that I'm bearish on the price in any kind of given 6 or 12 month period. It's more about outlining various pros and cons and then kind of sharing some of the concerns I had. And so I do agree that it is really the one other protocol that does have a substantial network effect. And so that's pretty much undisputable because so many tokens run on Ethereum now. There's so much development happening on Ethereum. And so in my kind of mind, I think the big concern is to make sure in some ways we separate the growth of the ecosystem from the growth of price in the long term. And because you can be, for example, very bullish on the amount of value that's settled on Ethereum, the amount of smart contracts that happen on Ethereum, and then have a somewhat different view on what happens to actual Ethereum token appreciation over the long run when you include bullish and bearish cycles. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you look back during the 2017 high, since then, about 3 times as much value settles on Ethereum, and the market cap is still just roughly back to where it was. And that for an Ethereum bull, what you then argue is that therefore Ethereum's undervalued, and therefore that's kind of a bull case for Ethereum. A somewhat different view is, for people that aren't familiar, John Pfeffer wrote a paper back in late 2017, kind of highlighting this problem. And his argument was that the utility protocols, even if they are used for a lot of, kind of ecosystem GDP, you could call it, if they're used for a variety of things, that the value won't necessarily accrue to those tokens. Basically, you can have a high velocity, and that there basically might not be kind of a quote unquote moneyness associated with those tokens in the long term. It doesn't preclude those from being moneyness. If we see things like more and more collateralization of Ethereum, if you see a strong preference towards staking and kind of enough people wanted to hodl it as money, it can still become money. But basically, there's somewhat of a separate argument about the size of the ecosystem and the price of the tokens in the long run. Although I do agree, I think in many points that I can see why a lot of people want to have a position in Ethereum, and I can also see that it does so far have a substantial network effect. And I think one of the challenges going forward is how Ethereum is going to transition, because Bitcoin is, for the most part, a finished product. It's still evolving, just like any other finished product. Like they're still making updates to Adobe Photoshop, for example, but it's in like
and Microsoft Word.
Exactly, but they're released things. Whereas Ethereum, because they're still doing radical changes to the underlying protocol, and they're as they shift from Ethereum 1 to Ethereum 2, they go from proof of work to proof of stake. They're changing some of the dynamics because they're running into these scaling problems. Basically, there's just a lot more implementation risk, I think, and so you're kind of getting a higher risk investment. And I'm kind of open about whether or not it's higher reward, and that's why my preference was I can see why people like it, but that my view is I still like the risk reward of Bitcoin the best.
And to be fair, Lynn and I would probably have roughly similar allocations for the same reason. When we look at asset allocation terms, there's 3 main metrics we use. One is liquidity preference. So Bitcoin has liquidity preference. So it's our base in this bet in the digital asset space. The next is time preference. Well, Bitcoin has been around longer. It also has a more understandable both network effect and value proposition. So you tend to hold it longer. But risk preference, and Ethereum has both of those, but not quite as superior as Bitcoin. Risk preference, there is because it's earlier in its network effects, the chances of more exponential price rises are higher. So you need a smaller allocation to have roughly similar effects in a portfolio. So we kind of agree. The one thing I did want to mention was that John Pfeffer paper. I kind of wrote a long article about it. Both of those things, firstly, he kind of said that the network effect didn't apply to anything except Bitcoin, which I think has been proven wrong. But the other one is he used the quantity theory of money which basically we threw out in about 1981. And I worry that trying to look at these in terms of moneyness is trying to compare Bitcoin with an apple. They're kind of not the same thing. I cannot...
Raul, can you explain what the quantity theory of money is?
Well, this is this MV equals PQ way of looking at, and that's why we talk about velocity of money, because that was one of the reasons the whole thing fell apart. And you know, you're trying to figure out what the overall value of the money proposition is within this. And I'm not sure any of that applies. And that was my issue with John Favreau's paper. I thought it was really interesting, but I spent a long time thinking about it. I thought, that doesn't work in the real world. I mean, there is literally zero correlation between money supply and inflation. So that kind of throws all of his arguments, all of that kind of Friedman stuff out of the window. So I looked at it and thought, well, what is the difference here? I think he's arguing the case for Bitcoin, about Bitcoin as a reserve asset, and then saying basically nothing else looks like that. And guess what? Nothing else looks like Bitcoin. And that's why we love Bitcoin. You know, it has a unique value proposition in the world. And many of these other protocols have their own unique value propositions. Many of them will not get network effect, and some that we don't even know of now will have massive network effects. It's the same happened with the internet, same happened with mobile phone networks and almost any other network that we've seen.
And so, Raul, does that mean that you allocated 10 or 20%, like Lynn was saying she might do if she were to allocate?
So I started at 80-20. The Ethereum's gone up a lot more already. And then I allocated more. So I'm like 60-35. And then I went further out the risk curve and I bought a basket of alts as well. Equally weighted.
Which ones?
Well, I'm not going to say because because I don't want to make it like I'm pumping anything, you know, because the alts world is a little bit wild and crazy. So I didn't want to do that. But basically what I took was I just looked at ones that looked like they were getting network effects. I asked people on Twitter. I got 6,500 responses. So I could figure out, okay, what looks like they've got network effect here. I look at the charts, and as long as they're a reasonable size market cap, I just took an equally weighted basket because I've no clue and I just don't have time to understand these in the depth that, you know, we've all had to learn Bitcoin in, and we're all having to get up to speed with Ethereum in. So I did that because I know in the end, everybody does what I've done, which is they go further out the risk curve. They do it in emerging markets. So you might start with the EM ETF, which is a very simple way of getting emerging market exposure. Then you might get more India exposure because you kind of favor that and it works for your time preference. Think, okay, India, I can see that this is going to work for the next 10 years. And then as that trend starts developing, you start buying all sorts of frontier markets because everybody's piling in the risk curve. And the same happens in crypto.
And so you don't even know if they were like DeFi tokens.
I've got a mix from derivatives to DeFi to DEX. I mean, I purposely made a kind of relatively balanced basket. You know, it wasn't a totally random process, but it was just some of that, to try and get an overall balance of the space. You know, I wanted interoperability, I wanted DeFi, I wanted fast payment networks. I wanted, you know, just different things, different protocols that allow smart contracts, and just got an overall basket of that.